This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good morning, everybody. Just allowing a moment for people to find their seats. My name is Barry Colfer, and I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute of International and European Affairs in Dublin. A very warm welcome to this morning's discussion. I'm very happy to introduce this morning's webinar on challenging climate myths, science, media, and public trust, where we're joined by one of the world leading figures on the topic, Professor Emily Shuckburgh, Director of Cambridge Zero at the University of Cambridge. And the discussion will also be moderated by our colleague, Dr Eileen Culloty from the DCU Institute for Future Media, Democracy and Society. This discussion forms part of the REthink Energy discussion series, organised by the IIEA and ESB, that seeks to promote discussion around the energy transition by fostering dialogue on pressing issues with world-leading thinkers and commentators. We are really delighted to be working with ESB on this important series. And indeed, I'm now delighted to hand over to Mary O'Connor, Chief Information Officer at ESB, who will introduce the event. Mary.
Thank you, Barry. Good morning, everyone. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to say a few words this morning to introduce this webinar on behalf of ESB. Everything we do at ESB is driven by our goal of reaching net zero carbon emissions by 2040. But it's a goal that we can't achieve alone. We depend on the trust of the communities where we operate so that we can build new renewables, expand and future-proof the electricity grid, and support customers in making more sustainable choices. This makes today's webinar really relevant and timely. The foundation of trust is a shared understanding of the facts, which is why it has been so worrying to see the rise of mis- and disinformation around climate, whether spread intentionally by bad actors or unknowingly by ordinary people simply trying to make sense of our complex world. Adding to the challenge is that we are all trying to navigate an online information and communications environment that is constantly changing, not least to new technologies like generative AI and agentic AI. As an energy provider committed to decarbonisation, we need to engage and be part of this conversation. I might just highlight here 3 ways we can do that and play our part in pushing back against climate myths. Firstly, hold firm to the value of facts and data. This is something we really believe in at ESB. For example, we have voluntarily published a sustainability report since 2011 and are committed to capturing and transparently reporting all our climate and sustainability metrics. Secondly, maintain an in-depth understanding of the information environment we operate in, even as it rapidly changes. At ESB, we are equipping our people with the training and tools they need to work with effectively, using data and various forms of technology and AI, whilst understanding and mitigating the risks involved. And thirdly, actively work to build and uphold trust through open communication with our customers and the wider public. This means also admitting where difficult trade-offs exist and being honest with people whom we encounter our own challenges in the net zero journey. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the insights of Professor Shuckburgh and Dr Culloty on how we can improve that communication, fight back against the misinformation and build greater trust in the energy transition. Thank you and enjoy the webinar. I'll hand back now to Barry.
Thanks very much, Mary. It's just left for me to introduce Dr Eileen Culloty, who is Assistant Professor in the School of Communications at DCU and Deputy Director of the DCU Institute for Future Media, Democracy and Society. Dr Culloty's work focuses on disinformation, media literacy, education and the future of public media. Dr Culloty also leads the Ireland Hub of the European Digital Media Observatory, EDMO, and serves as co-chair of Media Literacy Ireland, the national network for media literacy coordinated by Commerce Union. As a public intellectual, Dr Culloty will be well known to many of you, given her frequent, always sensible but sometimes sobering contributions to public discourse. And we're very pleased that you've been able to join us today as ever, Eileen, and I hand over to you for the discussion.
Thanks, Barry, and good morning, everyone, and welcome again to this IIEA webinar, which is part of the 2025 REthink Energy series in partnership with ESB. So today we're going to hear from Professor Emily Shuckburgh, a world-leading climate scientist and science communicator, and the director of Cambridge Zero, an innovative initiative that aims to coordinate and drive wide-ranging responses to climate change at the University of Cambridge. Before we get into the topic, there are just a few housekeeping rules, and namely the presentation and the Q&A will both be on the record. So please participate on that understanding. And you can participate by posing a question using the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. And you can also participate by posting a comment on social media. And if you do so, please remember to tag the IIEA and ESB. So in a few moments, we'll hear a presentation from Professor Shuckburgh and discuss the issue of climate myths, science, and public trust. But by way of maybe brief context, I think it's really notable that researchers across the sciences and social sciences have been debating these issues in some form for many decades now. And what all this research keeps telling us is that when it comes to communicating climate change, including its impacts and appropriate responses, there are major interconnected obstacles to overcome. And if we're talking about disinformation or myths, we really have to try and understand them within the context of those obstacles. For example, public understanding of science remains limited, and that's in general. So on one hand, you have relatively low levels of scientific literacy within a population. And on the other hand, climate science operates at a level of great complexity. And that creates a gap for myths and misunderstandings, but it's also a gap that can be exploited by people who want to spread disinformation. A related barrier is that media coverage of science in general, but of climate change in particular, tends to be very simplistic. I mean, we're probably all familiar with poor coverage of science, telling us that red wine is bad for us one week and is going to save us all the next week. But it's well documented that news coverage of climate policy tends to zone in on the political horse race aspect. So it will ask, what does this mean for elections? What does this mean for particular voting constituents? Will farmers support this party if they adopt that climate policy? We also know that news coverage is vulnerable to vested interests, including undeclared vested interests who are working to undermine climate policy. And this is something that we have seen in Irish media in recent weeks. Finally, we also know that the policy-making process itself is a major obstacle. That's partly to do with short-term electoral cycles that just promote and encourage short-term thinking, and it's also to do with sustained lobbying efforts. So often what we find is that it is vested interests that are shaping the agendas. And as a result, climate change has been reframed as an ideological battleground. So are you a pro-climate person or an anti-climate person, rather than an urgent collective crisis? And against that backdrop, it's little wonder that myths and misunderstandings and organized disinformation has thrived. And it would also be absurd to think that there are any simple solutions to those barriers. There are not. But there are some brilliant people who have dedicated their careers to conducting excellent science and to ensuring that it is translated into public understanding and into public policy. And we're fortunate to have one of those people with us today, Professor Emily Shuckburgh. A mathematician by training, Emily is now Professor of Environmental Data Science at the University of Cambridge, where, as we mentioned, she is also the director of Cambridge Zero. Within UK research, she leads the Centre for Doctoral Training on the application of AI to the study of environmental risks, and she is also a director at the Centre for Landscape Regeneration. Before that, she worked for more than a decade at the British Antarctic Survey, and she remains a fellow there. She is also an honorary fellow at the Energy Institute, the Royal Meteorological Society, and at Darwin College, Cambridge. And unsurprisingly, she has acted as an advisor on climate to the UK government in various capacities. I could go on noting many further prestigious accolades that she has acquired during her career, but there was one aspect of her biography that really stood out to me, probably because I'm from a communications background, and that's a recent book that she co-authored with King Charles III and Tony Juniper, the Lady Bird book, Climate Change. And I'm sure many of you here will recall as children learning about the world from reading those Lady Bird books. And I think it's a great testament to her science communication skills and her commitment to public understanding that she would be involved in such a project. So on that note, I will hand over to Professor Shuckburgh for a presentation of about 15 minutes. And please do post your questions as they come to you in the Q&A box. Thank you, Emily.
Oh, thank you very much, Eileen, and it's a pleasure to join you all today. So I'm just going to share my screen and I have a presentation where I'm going to start off by just giving you an overview of where the current state of climate science is, but then dive into some of the history of misinformation, particularly in the media, around climate science, how, as a climate science community, we've responded to that, how it still remains a challenge to this day, and interlinks to the issue of public trust. So just in terms of where we are today, in terms of our understanding of climate science, what's really changed over the last 5 to 10 years as we've started to see the impacts of climate change around the world in terms of extreme weather events, whether that's been deadly floodings that have happened, events that have happened in different parts of the world, wildfires that have caused dramatic devastation. Those episodes are bringing climate change to communities in a very real sense. Although it has to be said, and I'll come back to mention this towards the end, it's not always the case that people make the connection between those extreme weather events and climate change, even if that has been one of the key drivers towards the increased frequency of those extreme weather events. So just to give you a snapshot of where the climate is today, one of the most visible ways in which our climate has been changing has been the changing state of ice around the world, and particularly visible has been the state of our glaciers, where we've seen dramatic decline of glaciers around the world. You can see images of key glaciers where you can just visibly see the dramatic retreat that's happened over the last century. And in a sense, that was one of the first most visible signs of climate change occurring before we started to see that impact in terms of extreme weather. In a sense, it was the canary that started to demonstrate that the climate was changing. In terms of temperature rise, some of you will be aware that last year, 2024, was the first year that as a year as a whole surpassed 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial times. You can see that shown here. What you're seeing in all those grey lines are the individual years between 1940 and 2024. I've picked out the year 2000 to give you a sense of something that was one of the years at the end of last century where we'd reached about 0.7 degrees warming compared to pre-industrial times. But since the year 2000, we've seen a dramatic uptick in the warming to 1.55 degrees last year, and you can see that this year, 2025, has also been significantly warmer and is likely, if not to be a record-breaking year, but certainly close on a record-breaking year. And there are many other evidence of our changing climate in different parts of the climate system, and this is just one example, the dramatically reduced amount of the extent of sea ice in the Arctic. For a long time, we weren't seeing the same level of sea ice retreat in the Antarctic, in the southern hemisphere, but in recent years, we've also seen a dramatic loss of sea ice in the Antarctic. And this is, if you like, a dashboard of how that world has changed since pre-industrial times. Well, rather since the 1850, and you can see if you like, the story of climate change in these four graphs. First of all, we've seen a dramatic increase in the use of energy, something like a 20-fold increase over the last 170 years. And the vast majority of that increase has been as a consequence of our use of fossil fuels. You can see coal in red, oil in yellow, and gas in purple being the largest growth across that time period. And of course, when you burn fossil fuel, you produce carbon dioxide, and that's driven the increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere that you can see in the top right-hand graph. Those levels of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere are at least the highest that we've seen in 2 million years, probably a lot longer than that. The same is true of other key greenhouse gases, such as methane, which are also at record levels compared to the historical past. And as a consequence of that increase in greenhouse gases, we've seen this increase in the temperature of the surface of the Earth. And I'm going to come back to talk a little bit about this temperature increase. So I want you just to look at that bottom temperature increase graph, which in broad terms over the last 50 or so years has seen a pretty steady increase. I think you'll agree, with some ups and downs, because you get some years that are warmer, some years that are colder. There are natural cycles that sit on top of the climate change signal there. And then the other example that I have here is of sea level rise, which has also been steadily increasing over this time period. Of course, one of the key things that we use as climate science to understand the future risk is computer simulations of future climate under different scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions. And those are reported in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC reports, which come out every 5 or so years. This is the results for those two quantities I just showed you, surface temperature and sea level, out to the end of the century under different scenarios. The red scenarios are the higher greenhouse gas emission scenarios. The blue scenarios at the bottom are those that are more compliant with the Paris Agreement to keep temperatures well below 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century, and if possible below 1.5 degrees. I just highlight that even under those, if you like, best case scenarios of in terms of being compliant with the Paris Agreement, the long-term commitment to sea level rise is still quite significant. And in the worst case scenario, if we move forward a couple of centuries, we may be seeing many meters of sea level rise in the highest emissions scenarios. One of the aspects of climate-related risks that sometimes, in some ways, overlooked is the interconnectedness of those risks and how they cascade through our systems. And so understanding how climate change can impact our world, whether it's through the knock-on effects on supply chains because of climate change impacting key aspects of those supply chains, like the distribution of goods through the Panama Canal, or whether it's about impacting our health through the spread of diseases. The image at the bottom there shows an image from the other summer when Paris was key arrondissements in Paris were defumigated because of the increasing spread of the mosquitoes that spread dengue fever, which is starting to spread into southern Europe, or the impact of repeated climatic events damaging infrastructure through flooding events followed by extreme wildfires or droughts, or causing that sort of devastation, or indeed the impact in terms of the geopolitical implications of climate change. One way in which the IPCC tries to bring together an understanding of those risks and understand how those risks accumulate at different levels of warming is through this figure, which has been a key part of the IPCC reports for the last 3 or 4 cycles, is this image, which tries to bring together the evidence around 5 key categories. The first is looking at the threats to what the IPCC called unique and threatened systems. This would be things like coral reefs that are particularly vulnerable to climatic change. And then there's a set of issues: extreme weather events, distribution of impacts, global aggregate impacts, which describe the way in which extreme weather and other climatic impacts are affecting communities around the world. And then the final category that's assessed under this framework is called large-scale singular events. And that is basically shorthand for something genuinely catastrophic happening, such as the collapse of the vast ice sheets covering Greenland or West Antarctica, the dieback of the Amazon rainforest, release of methane from the vast stores in the frozen Arctic, the collapse of the overturning circulation of the ocean, or a number of other aspects of the climate system where we're concerned that a really significant tipping point may be passed. So this shows broadly the levels of risk that we are estimated to be at the current time, with high risk in terms of some of those unique systems and moderate to high risk in terms of other aspects. And then if we move forward to look at where at the end of the century it's estimated that current global actions and policies would take us, you can see that each of these categories move into either high or very high risk. So what does the science say we need to do to avoid those levels of risk? This graph shows in the black dots emissions of carbon dioxide globally since 1980 to the present day. You can see that steady increase with just a small dip down. You might be able to notice the COVID year. And then the green kind of trajectory broadly shows the trajectory that's necessary if we are to have a reasonable chance of keeping temperatures below 1.5 degrees of warming. And you can see there the reason why so many countries have been adopting a net zero target of around about the middle of the century. So where does public opinion sit in all of this, and where does misinformation sit in all of this? Well, back in 2009, there was a really concerted effort to, in many ways, I think, to disrupt what was then the Copenhagen Climate Conference. And some of you will remember the ClimateGate scandal. This was where climate scientists' emails were hacked and then released, and a particular spin was taken on those emails to suggest that somehow there had been a collusion amongst the scientific community to try to hide what was really happening in terms of climate science, and this was essentially an effort to discredit the climate science. It gained an awful lot of media traction at the time, and created a real crisis in some sense in the climate science community, because there was a real sense that there was a reduction in trust of climate scientists as a consequence of this. So there was a following in the aftermath of this, a real attempt by the climate science community to try to reach out to the public, engage the public more significantly, and to counter misinformation such as this in the media. Here are just some of the attempts that were made at the time. This was a sort of pre-social media age, in a sense, and so the focus at the time was on, included engaging in blog posts, and these are just two of the websites that were set up in the aftermath of that ClimateGate incident. The first one, which was quite influential at the time, was Real Climate. This was an attempt of climate scientists to really explain to a wider public what the climate science was really saying. And this other website, Skeptical Science, I think it was interesting because if you look on the left-hand side of this Skeptical Science webpage, which is still live today, you'll see it lists 10 of the most quoted climate myths. And it really was the case, and still is the case, that there's really a small number of climate myths that continually get traction. And so countering those repeated climate myths has been a key focus of where the climate science community has been directing its efforts. So after the ClimateGate saga started to dwindle, then of course there was a new saga that was really promoted by those that were skeptical or denying the climate science, and there was around about 2014, 2015, there was a lot of emphasis in the skeptical media on the suggestion that climate change had stopped. So you recall that I pointed out the graph of temperature rise over the last 50 years, which has been broadly increasing with some annual variation on top of it. Well, in amongst that, if you can find small periods of time where the temperature hasn't increased as much as in other periods, if you take a short time period, And that was what was focused on at this period. What was interesting here, you'll see this is I took a screenshot of the old original article from the Mail on Sunday that mentioned some of this, and you'll see that the Mail on Sunday in this instance was taken to the UK Press Standards organisation, and they upheld a complaint against the Mail on Sunday for this. And I think that those sort of taking the media on when they really are promoting misinformation has been actually quite successful over the years in terms of trying to counter some of the worst of the misinformation. Obviously, that doesn't apply to the misinformation that's spread over social media. Another thing that's been, I think, really quite helpful, that really started in the aftermath of ClimateGate, has been a number of organisations who have really been focused on getting on the front foot of explaining, both to other media organisations and to the public more generally, some of the key questions around climate science and the implications of climate science. And these are just two of the UK organisations that have been at the forefront of that, Carbon Brief and the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. And I think they've genuinely had a really positive influence in terms of reducing the amount of misinformation. But just to finish off, where are we today in terms of public opinion on climate change? So this is the latest polling from the UK for just two of the quantities which there's been significant data going back many years. This is just showing the data from 2019 to today of two quantities, people's belief in climate change and their concern about climate change. And on the one hand, you might say that this hasn't changed very much over that time period, that broadly around 70% or so of people in the UK population believe that climate is changing and that it's largely due to human activity, and broadly 60-something or other percent of people think that concerns about climate change have not been exaggerated. But at the same time, you'll notice that each of these, there has been a slow decrease in the percentages just over the last few years. And I think that's a concern that we're seeing at the same time as the climate changing at an ever greater rate and the risks of climate change increasing. We are starting to see a decrease in the number of people in the UK who believe that climate change is occurring and that the risks are very real. And so I think there is an ongoing need to really counter the misinformation on the climate science, because unless we have accurate information, we can't make sensible decisions on this topic, which has such broad-ranging societal importance. So I will leave it there, and I really look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was a really great, clear presentation, which we would expect from an expert science communicator. I was interested in asking you some questions about science first and the role of scientists more specifically before we go into the misinformation in particular, because I think something that's often come up in the public communication of climate change is the role of scientists themselves. And I know that there's been some discussion amongst scientists about where they feel comfortable in presenting their scientific evidence, trying to convey uncertainty, and that this has been used against them. And then also some have expressed, concern about becoming advocates, and then others say, well, you need to become an advocate because it's a very serious issue. So maybe could you, for the rest of us who aren't part of that community, maybe bring us how that discussion has evolved?
Yeah. Well, let me take the advocate or not question first of all. There is a spectrum of opinion amongst the climate science community as to how much of an advocate one should be, and I've always thought that it's fine that there's a spectrum. Where scientists are individuals in the same way as everyone else, and it's right that they have a different opinion. My personal view has always been that I think that we have a particular role as climate scientists in this debate, and therefore I personally have felt that that role is best placed, actually not really being on the advocate side of things. Other people, I think, are better placed to do the advocacy, whereas I personally think that climate scientists are best placed to, as dispassionately as possible, convey the evidence, and allow others to make the decision as to what they do about that evidence, because I think that that is the best way in which we preserve that trusted relationship with those that we're communicating to. So that's my own personal position with regards to where I sit on the advocacy spectrum, but others take a different viewpoint. I do certainly feel that I have a responsibility as a scientist studying this to communicate widely what our scientific findings say. So that's where I sit on that. You mentioned uncertainty, and that's long been a challenge in terms of how can we appropriately convey scientific uncertainty associated with any of our findings. It's not unique to climate science, of course. It's a challenge that comes across many different scientific domains. One thing that I have observed over the years is that just the word uncertainty is very easily misunderstood in a more general audience. And so many times when we are talking about scientific uncertainty, we mean something that you can specifically measure in terms of how uncertain the confidence bounds on a particular finding, whereas often that's interpreted as being that we don't know. And so that question of whether or not the statements we're making as scientists, whether it's about uncertainty or something else, is being understood in the way that we mean it by the audience that we're trying to communicate to, feels as though it's incredibly important to understand, because otherwise we think we're saying something, somebody else is, who we're talking to is hearing something different, and actually that communication hasn't happened effectively. So being really careful and really clear in what we mean and ensuring that people understand it in the way that we mean it, I think is critical to the success there.
Right, and I know I think it's really interesting the point you make about, scientists themselves are quite a diverse group. I think we sometimes talk about scientists as if they all agree and are just in their labs doing their work and don't have any individual personality or opinions and take different views on things. So I think that's quite an important point. But also, I think you mentioned the 2009 kind of attack on climate scientists and this climate gate. But more recently, we're seeing a lot of attacks on science and scientists and their work. So does that make it harder for scientists to adopt this? Or do you think that could actually become an advantage where scientists will have to come together and affirm that, no, this is the evidence, we have to stand by the evidence? Or is there a risk of science becoming extremely politicized?
So, well, I think again, there's lots of things to unpack from that. So, I mean, having lived through the eras, and there's been multiple of them when climate science in particular has been under quite aggressive attack in different points. Then, fundamentally, some of that has been deeply unpleasant, and some of the most prominent climate scientists were receiving death threats, were receiving really aggressive and nasty attacks, either via email or at times, people coming up to them in aggressive ways. So that was just unpleasant and really shouldn't, is not helpful in any context. On the other hand, where do we sit today in terms of as a scientific community coming together to really try to address misinformation? I think that, as I was alluding to at the end, it's a battle that's never finished. It's quite clear that because of some of the things that you were mentioning at the start, that fundamentally the implications of climate science are deeply entwined into the political reality. And I think as a consequence, it's one of those topics that is inevitably going to be a port of attack if you want to try to try to undermine the reasons for doing something whether it's associated with net zero policies or any other implications of climate-related policy, then an obvious place that you might try to attack is attack the underlying science that is the basis for those policies. So I think there's almost an inevitability. I don't think that a scientist's role is to advocate for a particular policy, but our role is absolutely to preserve the integrity of the science that underpins that decision making. So I think that our role is stronger now than ever, because of the importance of those, ensuring that those policies are rooted in firm evidence.
And I think because trust is something you mentioned, and it's in the title of our talk, and it seems to me like there's an entire, I mean, you could spend your entire life attending webinars on some aspect of trust. Everyone's trying to build and increase trust in their sector, but it always seems like this very tricky subject to pin down. What exactly is it that we're worried about? And when it comes to science, do you see a difference between trust in scientific evidence, trust in scientists, trust in, say, academic institutions, or are they all part of the same thing for you? When you think about trust, what is it that you want people to trust and why?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And as I said in my presentation, in the aftermath of the ClimateGate episode, there was really, really strong concern in the scientific community around, or particularly the climate science community, around this issue of trust in scientists. Because again, at the time, if we undertook any polling, then we would find that trust in climate science had plummeted. And so there were a lot of initiatives that were put in place to try and alleviate that. Strong emphasis on public engagement. I really genuinely think that probably one of the things that actually made the biggest difference, and I think the trust levels have slowly recovered actually. So whatever we did somehow make some sort of a difference. But I think probably some of the things where those examples that I gave of the websites, of the organizations that were focused on being almost the intermediaries between the science itself and particularly the media organizations or the social media world, I think that they have played a really critical role in helping to rebuild that trust, because in a sense, the climate science stands for itself. I mean, the climate data is the climate data. And the problem, in a way, wasn't anything to do with the information itself. It was to do with the way that that information was being transmitted. And so the fact that organizations were able to act in that space of the transmission to try to help support its accurate representation in the media has been really, really helpful, I think. Now, that's not to say that the public engagement activities aren't also really important, because that's the one way in which you can actually directly engage people in the research, and there's nothing better than people having some sense of being involved for them to really have a greater sense of trust in what's being undertaken.
And then thinking specifically around the myths and the kind of maybe misunderstandings and disinformation, are there particular topics that have you kind of suggested that there were some things that have remained persistent throughout the years? What are those on? And also, is it, because as I do research on misinformation, and sometimes it seems to me, particularly in areas that are really important to public policy, you can have public misunderstanding of something, which we would prefer was there. But when you have journalists and policymakers who fundamentally misunderstand it, that's almost a much bigger problem. So I'm just wondering, are there myths that you find that just persist across those groups?
So I would say that in the climate area, the key thing has been that there's one or two quite prominent climate skeptics who've actually, in some instances, been the most prominent throughout the whole course of the last 30 years, particularly in the US. And they tend to have the same topic areas that they're continually promoting. that have been debunked many, many, many times in the past, but that doesn't stop them continuing to promote them. My sense is that actually in the UK and Europe, many of those climate science myths are much less in circulation now than they were even 10 years ago. But they're alive and well in the US. And over the summer, President Trump put out an essentially alternative climate change report that included in its authorship a number of those very prominent scientists who've long been questioning the climate science. So I don't, from a climate science community, I think we have to just continue to point out the weaknesses in those alternative viewpoints and point out the wealth of data and evidence that supports the mainstream climate science arguments. I'm not sure there's much more that we can do as a community, unfortunately.
And I know you're involved in the landscape regeneration project, and the previous time you spoke at the IIEA, one of the questions that came up was around farmers and land users, which often is quite antagonistic towards climate policy. But I'm just wondering, from maybe your experience in that, is to what it seems to me sometimes when we talk about countering misinformation, there's this idea that if we just give people more facts, but often I don't think it's the facts that bother them. It's all those other aspects of their livelihood and their vision of the future. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe speak a bit about that maybe facts only get us. We should still obviously have the facts and the evidence, but not be misguided in what they're going to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really, really important. So when we're talking about public understanding of science, then obviously that's important, and it's important to have the facts and evidence in order to make decisions, but it's very, very clear that any decisions are going to be based on an awful lot more things than our understanding of the science itself. The Centre for Landscape Regeneration project, I think, has been a really interesting one because it's incorporated many of the different aspects that we know are important. So in terms of engagement, it's been a project where we have engaged very, very closely with the farming community. So we have various different instruments measuring greenhouse gases on farms, and we've been working closely with the farmers on whose farms those instruments are, and sharing all the data with them and involving them in the science itself. And so that has been very important. But we've also, going to your point about that's only the starting point, this is a project that's looking very much at solutions and how we might be able to manage land differently in order to reduce the climate impact. And so we've been, as part of that, seeking ideas from the farmers as to how they think they could be managing their land differently. And then we've been incorporating that into the science process to evaluate the effectiveness or not of different potential strategies. And so it's been a very much an activity that has been hugely collaborative, and I think has been very powerful as a consequence. And one where, to come back to some topic we were mentioning earlier, where trust and the trust levels that we've built up between the different communities has been absolutely integral to the success of the project. And I would love to think that it's somewhat of a model of how we could be building that sort of collaborative approach across science and into communities across a wide range of other topics in the climate area and beyond that have such important societal implications.
And I mean, it's been an agenda within science communication for a long time, this idea of co-creation and collaboration. But of course, that also means more funding and more people trained in those areas. Now, at my university, we train people in science communication, so we're all in favor of that agenda. But, it's not, I think sometimes those things are added on as nice little extra bits rather than being treated as actually really core to the success of any initiative. Before we go to some of the Q&A questions, I just wanted to come back on what you were saying about in the wake of the 2009 ClimateGate that one of the responses was to almost take on the media and then respond directly and then rely on those intermediary actors like the Carbon Brief to maybe provide training to the media. And you were saying that that's been quite successful. Is your sense, maybe just as a scientist in general, is that media coverage has improved over the years? Is there a greater appreciation of science, or has it remained at does it fall to individual scientists or individual outlets?
I think some aspects of the media has improved. So there was a stage around that ClimateGate example where the BBC, for example, had an editorial policy where they felt they had to give equal weight to different viewpoints, even if one was very much a fringe viewpoint and the other one represented the bulk of the scientific community. And sometime post that ClimateGate saga, they actually changed their editorial policy so that it was in greater recognition of the overwhelming scientific consensus on the topic. That was the BBC. Obviously, other parts of the media continues to have often a more political perspective, and so it is to this day. We do still see significant misinformation appearing in the media, and of course even more so on social media.
Often, a great essay I remember, I think it was originally published in the 60s about the two cultures. And he was talking particularly about the UK and the idea of there being people who study science and are knowledgeable about science, and then people who do arts and culture, and journalists and media people tend to fall into that side and have very low level of exposure to science. And one of the consequences then is they might unwittingly just cover science very poorly. I think we're still trying to address that problem. One of the questions here from one of our participants is about the geopolitical environment and the quality of data. So she cites the example from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the US. So I think this is the reference to the statistician who produced statistics that Trump didn't like. So the statistician got fired and they were told to come back with new statistics. So is there a concern among climate scientists about the quality of data that you will have in different jurisdictions if science itself and the institutions behind it are being politicized in this way?
Well, I think the biggest concern at the moment in the climate science world is that, a key part of our understanding of the climate system is our ability to maintain long-term measurements of different parts of the climate system, whether that's measurements from space, from satellite data, or in the oceans. We have a fleet of floats that are continually monitoring the ocean. And one of the very real concerns at the moment is some of those long-term monitoring programs, where they've been funded historically by the US, are under threat, essentially through a politicization of that funding. So that is something that's a very real concern at the moment in the climate science community. Yeah.
And another question here, I think that is a very interesting one, is about the rise of so-called climate despair, where people just feel completely overwhelmed by climate change and by the lack of action on it. Is this something that you've come across in your work, or is it something that factors into climate communication?
So, obviously that is something I've come across in my work. One thing that so you mentioned at the start that I lead Cambridge Zero in the University of Cambridge, and that does span everything the university does around climate change, and that includes all the work that we do on the solutions side of climate change, whether that's associated with renewable energy technologies or alternative modes of transport that are cleaner, or whether it's looking at nature-based solutions or alternative business models, or etc. And so my approach to eco-despair is to point out all the opportunities for innovation that exist in the climate-related area. And to me, that's a very positive way of approaching what's otherwise a really quite despairing challenge.
And another question here is coming back to what we touched on earlier about, say, the false balance of having alternative views. And do you think that if you were to, say, appear on a panel with a climate denier or a climate skeptic, that by just participating in that panel, you would be legitimizing alternative views? I think this is a topic lots of people are trying to negotiate.
Yeah. So and I mean, as I say, going back to the ClimateGate era, that was a really significant question that we would frequently wrestle with. Exactly that. On the one hand, you want to engage, and you want to counter viewpoints, but then there was this exactly the concern that you raise about, does that just legitimize? I mean, I think it's a complicated question, but I do think going back to that example of the BBC, where as a public broadcaster, they have a duty to be able to be fairly representing the breadth of views, but that didn't necessarily mean inevitably having an equal weight given to a fringe view versus a mainstream view. I feel that that's probably the most straightforward way of addressing this issue that the questioner raises.
And sticking with the media, there's another question here about maybe mandatory climate change programming or coverage, particularly on public broadcasters, since they are publicly funded. Something I've been thinking about recently is that many of us grew up with public information ads and films reminding us, about dangers and things. And have you any thoughts on whether we should, I mean, making something mandatory automatically makes people go, this is state-sponsored propaganda, but this idea of just public information campaigns is something that we used to do and we've just moved away from.
So I wonder, I mean, going back to the topic we were talking about a moment ago about whether or not just telling people more about a topic means that they change their thoughts and behaviors, or whether actually it's much more complicated than that. And if you're wanting to influence people, the way people's choices, then there's many more things than telling them about the science that go into that. I suspect that is important to consider if you're thinking about some sort of public information approach. And I suspect that, well, certainly the evidence I think shows that something that's much more engaging, the sort of thing that I was talking about in terms of the collaboration we have with our farming community, about engaging with communities around solutions. And in that process, feeding scientific information into the decision making, but doing it very much as part of that more collaborative process, I think is probably likely to be more effective.
And coming back to this question of different roles, another participant has asked about, if trust is really important and trust is relational, then who is the best person to communicate with different segments of the public? Is it scientists? Is it science communication experts? Or is it these kind of intermediaries or knowledge brokers that you were mentioning earlier?
But I think it's all of the above, isn't it? I mean, of course, there are, and I guess this is the other thing that I feel when we were talking right at the start about there's not one thing as a scientist, there's a diversity of different people. And some people are brilliant scientists and absolutely terrible communicators. And some people are fantastic scientists and fantastic communicators and etc. And so I think it's about a diversity of people acting in a diversity of different ways to best use their talents. I do think that having both scientists communicating directly as well as having intermediary organizations, there's roles for both.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Not everyone's going to be a Jane Goodall, and have this amazing public persona and able to navigate all of that. And we shouldn't expect them to be able to do, they're experts in their own area. Another question here is about, what are ways to make carbon zero initiatives more profitable than traditional approaches? And are there any proven examples of this working?
Yeah, so I mean, much of the debate now has moved on to exactly that question. I would say in the UK and Europe, has moved beyond questioning whether or not the climate science is true or not, to looking at the economics of different solutions. Now, that's also a place where a lot of the disinformation has then started to enter in the UK and Europe. As I say, the US is still in a different place where a lot of the science is still criticised. But in the UK and Europe, I think that is where things are predominantly targeted. And so ensuring that there is accurate information on things like what makes up your energy bill and why, what exactly the reasons for energy bills being high are, so that people can make considered decisions associated with that, is really, really important, because otherwise we just see the disinformation shifting to a different area.
And another question here is back to data, and it's about the transparency of data sets. And they're saying that the data and methodologies need to be as transparent as possible to build trust and credibility. Presumably that's something you agree with. And in my own area, when we're dealing with disinformation of any kind, you just think it's really important that everything you do is transparent so people can come and see it and critique it. But then you also have this challenge of you have to present it in a way that people can understand it and not misunderstand it. Is that an issue?
Yeah, so I think that openness and transparency has been something that's really improved significantly over the last maybe 2 decades in the science world, and that can only be a good thing. So it is now the case, pretty much, if you publish a paper, you have to publish the data set, and if it involves computer code, you publish the computer code behind the work that you've been undertaking, and that is obviously just an essential part of the scientific process, is that scientific studies are replicable. That you can only understand if they're replicable if you make the underlying data and an approach publicly available. So I think that the moves that have made that the default and standard are really, really important within the science community, but also important for that wider building of trust.
And perhaps coming back to our despair point here, one of the commentators is saying that during the financial crisis in Ireland, when many households were in mortgage arrears, it was known that people were just putting the letters from the bank into the bin. So they were kind of in complete denial and just afraid to even open the letter. So this person's wondering if there is any kind of research into this type of fear thresholds that maybe at a certain point people just won't engage.
Yeah, so I think there's a sort of maybe even a broader point that comes back to your question that you had a moment ago about eco despair, that actually there's a kind of fine line, isn't there, between being able to clearly articulate the scale of the risk associated with climate change or any other sort of global threat, without venturing into that sense that the problem is so awful that we can't do anything about it, and we'll just put our heads in the sand and hope it goes away, even though we know that it's not going to go away. And so navigating between clearly articulating the scale of the threat and what I was describing earlier about giving a sense that it isn't impossible to solve this, that we have many of the building blocks for addressing the challenge, is really important to do the two in tandem, because otherwise it is just human instinct to, put your head under the duvet and hope it'll all go away.
And I think it also comes back to what you nicely articulated about different sectors of different roles to play. And I mean, there's clearly a big role for psychology and skilled psychological communicators as well, to maybe help address some of those issues. Finally, there was 2 questions that were just on the question of like who is being impacted maybe by the climate myths. Are there particular age groups, particular sectors of society? Is it those who are being left behind or marginalized in some way, or is there a very different pattern?
Oh, that's a really good question to which I don't actually know the answer, but I think it's something that, yeah, very interesting and really, if there is somebody who has been looking into that, I'd be delighted to hear from them.
I suspect it might vary as well, depending on where you are and what kind of myths were being put forward. So I'll just scan through to make sure. There's a very final quick question about AI, and you mentioned using AI in your own research, and then it's about the environmental impacts of AI and what your thoughts are on this.
Yeah. Okay. So, well, big topic. So I'll try and be brief. A lot of my research is using AI nowadays. So there's huge opportunities for AI to be used to advance our understanding of climate and environmental science. But obviously, on the one hand, there are concerns about the energy and other resource use of AI itself, as well as actually some of the kind of ethical concerns about how AI is trained and ensuring that there aren't biases that are really emphasized through that training, which is particularly important on climate, which does have such an important societal implications. So huge opportunities, but has to be handled with care, I think, is the short summary.
And I suspect you'll be asked questions like that many times into the future. So with that, we're now just gone 12:30. So I'll thank again Professor Emily Shuckburgh. I'll thank the IIEA and the ESB for sponsoring this series. So thank you very much, everybody.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.